Good evening. Hi, my name is Joe Alberson, and as you can tell, I'm wearing my Chicago Cubs shirt and Chicago Cubs hat. What? Right here? Oh. Oh. My Chicago Cubs hat. And tonight I'm going to give a brief history lesson on the Chicago Cubs. The Cubs were founded in 1870. Them and the Atlanta Braves are the two oldest teams in the professional baseball. Now, a little interesting fact, the Chicago Cubs started out as the Chicago White Stockings. The Atlanta Braves started out in Boston, moved to Milwaukee, ended up in Atlanta. They argue who's the older team. Since the Great Fire of Chicago, the Cubs didn't play for 2 years. But Atlanta has moved from city to city, so that makes Chicago Cubs the longest one-city team in professional baseball. The Cubs in 1870 were one of the few teams, and it wasn't like it was today. Players were bought and switched teams without even telling the teams when they were leaving. And usually teams with the most money produced the most and won the most. The Chicago Cubs have had more than one name. They haven't always been the Cubs. They started out as the White Stockings, like I said earlier. Then they changed their name to the Colts, then to the Orphans, then to the Cubs. It's kind of funny because once the White Stockings were no longer being used, another Chicago team became, and they took the name White Stockings, later on becoming the White Sox. The early years, the Cubs were known as a dynasty. They won a lot for multiple reasons. They had the best players, and for the most part, there was no Major League Baseball draft or anything, so it depended on where you were in the United States. Chicago, being a big city, even in the 1800s and early 1900s, had pretty much a bigger pool of select from, and they had the surrounding, Great Lakes region, northern Indiana, southwestern Michigan, Illinois, Wisconsin, that whole general. They had a lot of talented baseball players in that general vicinity. The Cubs haven't won a World Series since 1908. 104 years, almost 105 years. This year will be the 105th year. That's the longest of any professional sports who have not won a championship. Now, the Cubs have won division titles, and have played in a World Series since then. The last pennant they won was in 1945, which was also disastrous for the Chicago Cubs and Chicago Cubs fans. Now, being a Cubs fan, we all know, we expect they're going to lose. But yet, we still turn out for games and watch them on TV. And it's just a bonus when they do win, but most Cubs fans try not to get their hopes up too high for a winning season because it's just disastrous when it does not turn out the way we expected or want it to. Now, the Cubs have been cursed, and I found on Major League Baseball / History channel called The Curse of the Billy Goat. It was in 1945 during World War II and during the World Series. A prominent farmer in Illinois, the name of Billy Sianis, bought 2 box tickets, most expensive tickets at Wrigley Field. The owner at the time was P.K. Wrigley, and after fans started complaining about how bad the goat smelled and all sorts of stuff, he asked Billy to leave with the goat, and he put up a fight. Eventually he did leave, but as he was leaving, he cursed the Cubs, shouting out, "They'll never win again," and to this day, it's held true. And you hear a bunch of different legends about the Cubs. In 1969, late August at New York, when the Cubs had a 9-game lead, a black cat runs in front of the dugout, and they end up losing the division, which, is one of the greatest meltdowns of all time. And the curses and stuff, it's just part of every team has curses. If you look at it, if you want to dig deep enough, you can find a curse for everybody. The Cubs have had interesting owners and personalities in the booth for TV, especially when TV once took off. Wikipedia, which everybody Googles once in a while, you can find some interesting facts like the Chicago Cubs. You learn their different names, and that Wrigley Field wasn't always named Wrigley Field, and the Cubs, played at different parks other than Wrigley Field. They have been at Wrigley Field since 1912, but it goes that way. One of the earliest owners around the turn of the century was Albert Spalding. He was at Illinois, but he also pitched for the Cubs. He was a really good pitcher, but he bought the team, managed it, and also played at the same time he owned it. But he ended up quitting to start a sporting goods store, or sporting goods supplies, called Spalding. I think some people have heard of that. And I learned that, I found that on ChicagoCubs.com on history. I really did not know anything that Spalding had anything to do with the Cubs, but it was kind of interesting. The Cubs, in 1914, is when Charles Wigham bought into the team. Now, what's so interesting about this is Wrigley Field used to be called Wigham Field, and he owned the Chicago Whales, which was a different baseball league altogether. And it failed, that league did, and so when the Cubs brought him on board, when he bought out the Cubs with the Wrigleys, they started playing at Wigham Field, which is now Wrigley Field. It was just interesting. A couple years later, Bill Wrigley bought out the Cubs completely and renamed the field. And he named it Chicago Field, Cubs Field. Then he just took his namesake, Wrigley Field. And and the Wrigley family owned the team for many seasons. And then it finally sold out to a Tribune company, and the Tribune owned it up until 2009, which they eventually sold to Ameritrade, or the Rickett family, recently. And then I found this YouTube video about the Cubs, and it really summed up the whole losing attitude for the Cubs. And the only thing I really remember from it is they keep on going back to the glory days, but it was never of winning. It was just glory days. I hope you learned a little bit something new about the Chicago Cubs, and I thank you for listening. Thank you, and have a great night.